name is Julia. Welcome back to Save the Vibes. We are not live here on KRUI, but here we have in the studio with us today Dr. Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who is a history and Italian studies professor at New York University and the author of numerous books, but most recently being Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
It's a pleasure.
In preparation for speaking with you today, of course, I watched just about every video, every video of yours I could find on YouTube. And an interesting fact that you mentioned that I thought it would be a really good starting point here is that 30% of the population at any given time has authoritarian leanings, and that this is in a global sense. And so, according to the trending news today, there are many right wing political movements happening across the world, such as in Hungary with President Viktor Orban, in France with the rise of the National Party led by Marine Le Pen. What distinguishes fascism from other types of nationalist movements, and where do we see fascism, actual fascism, rising in the world today?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, like classic fascism was a product of the 1920s and 30s. It was, it was really limited to Spain, the early Franco years, but especially Mussolini and Hitler. Mussolini being the person who invented fascism, and it was very much a product of World War One, of the total upheaval, of the upheaval with everyone's lives, with millions and millions of men who were, I mean, obviously killed, but also disabled, changes in gender relations. And one of the things I found in my research, and fascism is the first example, is that authoritarians appeal when societies have been had a huge amount of change. Now, World War One was the biggest example, and there's progress made, and it could be gender, it could be racial equity, and there you had the beginning of anti-colonial activities, and so it leads to a backlash. And so fascism was this very pure form of a state-driven, racist, nation that wanted to turn back the clock on and make women kind of the tools of the state for procreation, but only the right kinds of babies. And in the Nazi version, it was, having the state channel to create a master race, right? And the other thing, fascism was expansionist in Italy and Germany, that it leads to imperialist campaigns and conquering and looting and plundering. So today, things work differently, and there are many fascist aspects of that remain. People calling national politicians, former leaders, using words like vermin, calling people garbage and scum and vermin, and talking about them as animals. This has remained from fascism. Hitler used it for the Jews. Mussolini used it eventually for Jews, but also for leftists. So that, and then the whole idea that we need these hyper-nationalist movements to defeat Marxism and defeat communism. That comes out of fascism. But things work differently today. There are not as many one-party states where there's no political opposition allowed. Really, it's places like North Korea and China, which are communist. So fascism remains in its spirit, in its language, in many policies, but today I use the word authoritarian because that encompasses the fact we still have elections, like in Hungary, in Turkey, you have authoritarians, but they have elections and they're not one-party states.
Is it possible to see fascism in a democracy such as what we're seeing across Europe? Are these actually considered fascist movements?
Some people use the word fascism for them, and there's a whole debate on this, including what do we do about Trump and the GOP? Are they fascist? Do they want fascism? And so there is a debate whether you can use the word today, right? Mm-hmm. Or you want to restrict it. And I'm kind of in the middle, where in some ways it's not useful to label Orban a fascist, because then people say, well, wait a minute, it's not a one-party state. It's not a pure dictatorship. So what are you talking about? That's why I use the word authoritarian. And fascism was just the first stage of authoritarianism, which is when the executive power, the personal power of the leader kind of takes over, eradicates, or highly damages the independence of the judiciary, the opposition parties, and allows the leader to have supreme power and even immunity from prosecution. So there are many, many similarities, but definitely some of the same conditions that led to fascism, like people feeling they need to turn the clock back on racial emancipation, on gender emancipation, all that stuff, that exists today.
You brought up a good point a second ago with mentioning how this relates to Donald Trump and the rise of this kind of Trumpism version of republicanism in American politics since the release of your book, which served as an analysis of the rise to power of Benito Mussolini in Italy. He essentially created the blueprint for right wing dictatorship. As it relates to Donald Trump and with the upcoming election, since we're 33 days out now at this point, the publication of Project 2025 by the Heritage Foundation, you've spoken very publicly and been very critical of the policies contained in Project 2025 and how they relate to fascism. A common response is that, it can't happen here in the US. We have too many guardrails in place. That really wouldn't be possible. As entertaining as politics is right now, nothing's really a threat, an actual tangible threat to our democracy. But what is it that experts making this claim that there is a connection between the two, what are they seeing that indicates that the US is susceptible to a fascist movement?
Well, we already have many signs of this. So basically, Trump is an authoritarian. He's in my book. It was one of the first books to put him in historical perspective, look at him and see how does he bring forth, not just fascism, but also right-wing military dictatorships. Like Trump he's on record many times saying he wants the military to have a new role, not just abroad, which has been their role, but also he thinks protesters should be shot. He's talked about executing generals who are not loyal. He wants the military to be used in part for domestic repression. So he doesn't just borrow from fascism. He borrows from these other forms of authoritarianism. And what has happened to the GOP since he was president, is that, in my analysis, it's become an autocratic party. And that is, Trump has a genuine leader cult. It's extraordinary what he's been able to do. Working in a democracy, he has been able to have this personal control over the party, and now he has his daughter-in-law, Laura Trump, is the head of the Republican National Committee, and the money is raised from ordinary Republicans around the country. It goes to Trump and not to other campaigns. There's a lot of personalization of politics. And the GOP is now a party that is dependent on lying, such as the idea that Trump won the 2020 election, also lies about January 6th, which was an attempt to overthrow the government. So that's an example of how far have we come down the path of authoritarianism. We already had an attempt to overthrow the government with tens of thousands of people committing violence. And the GOP and Fox News and the other allies have been trying to cover this up and say it was just tourists, it wasn't violent, because that's what you do in history if you're not done. So they're dependent on corruption, on lying, on violence, and those are things that that's how authoritarian parties work. And they can't really have fair and free elections anymore in countries. That's why they engage in this election denial. And the last thing I'll say is that we never had a national experience of dictatorship in America, but we had a regional authoritarianism, which was the Jim Crow South. And we have a long history, not just in the South, of voter suppression, a lot of which is racially motivated, but also just political trickery, right? So places like Ohio, the GOP uses voter suppression very effectively. Redistricting, gerrymandering, these are all forms of voter suppression and voter just trying to game the results. so that it's not really a free and fair election, even though it seems to be. So we have all this history, and so that's why it can happen here, but it always looks different. That's why people don't see it coming. And so when you analyze something like what I do is that I look at the toolbook of global authoritarianism, and then I look at our history here, and you see how they meet. And Trump was very, very smart from the very beginning, 2016, to address himself to all kinds of extremists, including Southern racists who never liked Barack Obama, never thought he should have been there, plus neo-Nazis, plus all the other kinds of extremists, the militias. So he created a big tent so that everybody could be part of his Trumpism. And that's why some people would say, okay, well, isn't he repeating fascism? And in part he is, but he's also activating things that are specific to our country, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does seem that he really, his popularity increased with this emotional appeal, this appeal to people that felt like they had been forgotten, given that they weren't at the forefront of the progress being made for people that have historically been left behind. As a response, as you mentioned, the GOP does use a lot of rhetoric to combat against claims that they're fascist, such as, blaming the left, accusing the left, the radical left, of being a fascist movement or an authoritarian movement that's attempting to oust him from politics and disrupt the democratic process. Is there any validity or any weight to those claims, or are they simply just diversion tactics?
That part is diversion tactics, as is the idea that it's because what authoritarians do, I call it the upside down world of authoritarianism. You take everything and you flip it. So whereas they are an authoritarian party allied with Putin, allied with Orban, very close to Orban, they call the Democrats, those are the real authoritarians. And so a diversionary tactic is claiming that when Joe Biden stepped aside due to age and a sense that he wasn't as effective as he could have been, and Vice President Kamala Harris became the nominee, the Republicans are saying that was a coup. That was a coup attempt. So they will pick anything to have, but what we have to pay attention to is the big narrative lines. And one of them is that it's the Democrats who are authoritarians. And they're very good at doing that. But you brought up something really important about the validity of all this. Democrats had kind of neglected white working class people and rural populations. And the Biden administration has hugely corrected this, both with like manufacturing policies to start manufacturing in places, stuff about to address the opioid epidemic, right? But they were a population that was not served by Democrats. So Trump is a marketer at heart, and he's a brilliant marketer. And he's not the first one. There are others in my book who scan the political marketplace and see who is underserved, who is going to be susceptible to my appeals. And because he doesn't care about the working class, but he came to them and he said, "You've been forgotten. I love you, and I will fix it for you." And of course they voted for him. Here was somebody speaking to them directly. And authoritarians from Mussolini, Berlusconi, even Putin is less charismatic. They know how to use emotion to make people feel they care about them. And you see the huge crowds at Trump rallies. They feel that he loves them. And he's very good at making them think that. So he went and he said, "You are forgotten." Democrats didn't have anything to compete with that. So emotion is extremely important, and it's been actually authoritarians who have known how to use emotion until very recently with the Kamala Harris Joy and Love. That's really recent. But Hillary Clinton was not a joy and love and emotional person. So it was Trump who knew how to do that. So he gets credit for that. I believe it's a terrible tragedy for our nation that he doesn't actually care about the American people. He cares about his own power and riches. But he's very good at making people feel he cares about them.
That he is. I mean, as someone just that has obsessively watched the news since probably 2016, when I was a little too young to understand exactly what was going on, I could tell the emotional appeal. As I mean, even if you don't have much of a political background, Donald Trump on TV is someone that anyone can understand. Mm-hmm. I mean, just breaking down his vocabulary, I mean, it's not the most complex or mastered of vocabularies.
Mm-hmm. There are studies that he, especially in the whole 2016 campaign, and while he was president, they were a 4th or 5th grade level, his vocabulary. And the other thing he did is that he used all caps. And now most of his, now he's off Twitter and he's, or X, he's on Truth Social. Most of his posts are all caps, because I study propaganda. There's a chapter in my book about propaganda. And I also study visual things. Mm-hmm. And he's a hugely visual person. And so at the beginning, he would capitalize only some words in his tweets. And they were the words that he knew when people were scrolling and they would stand out to you. Stuff about his victimhood, stuff about the horrible Democrats, stuff about him being so great. He would capitalize those things. And he would use this very basic language that appealed to people who are either not very educated, or they want a politician who they feel is down to earth.
When there are serious, credible threats of authoritarianism or fascism on the rise globally in a political climate, what are the most effective practices in curbing that rise?
So recently we had a really good example in Poland. In 2023, they actually voted out, the opposition mobilized, and they did everything right. And the Poles voted out a far-right government that had all but banned abortion nationally. And it was horribly anti-immigrant, the same checklist of far-right things that we are having here and all kinds of other places. So what did they do? They exposed the corruption of the far-right government and their hypocrisy, which is a little harder to do here. And the GOP is highly organized with a very effective party machine for messaging, and they have Fox News. And there was no Fox News equivalent in Poland. But they did expose the hypocrisy, showing that government politicians were actually selling visas to immigrants and profiting, gouging them. So people didn't like that. They also appealed to women about abortion rights. And so, and they had positive messaging. They also had a 6-party coalition. Now we are really hindered with this because we've only got 2 parties. Mm-hmm. And that I want to say, if you only have 2 parties and they're giant, we're a giant nation, a big powerful nation, and one of those parties leaves democracy and doesn't recognize election results anymore and uses violence, what do? That's hard. And that's why we have Republicans for Harris now, and hundreds and hundreds of prominent Republicans, people who served with Trump, generals, are coming out and saying, for the good of the country, kind of put country over party this time and keep him out, because we know how dangerous it is for national security, for defense, these are not liberals. So the Poles were able to get 6 parties representing a wide swath of opinion, and they all unified against the far-right government. And the final thing they did is they mobilized emotion. We were talking about emotion. They had a march of 1,000,000 hearts, and the literally a heart was a logo. Mm-hmm. And it was about positivity, solidarity, kindness, all of the value. It was a values-based campaign, plus the anti-corruption and anti taking away reproductive rights. And what did it produce? They had a rally called the March of the 1,000,000 Hearts, largest turnout since communism fell in 1989, and then that led to the largest voter turnout since 1989. And now they have progressives in power. So those are things that are much harder to do here, but that's why when the Harris Walz campaign started talking about joy and love, I was like, this is good. This is what we need.
I do really enjoy the positivity that's been coming from the Democratic Party since they've switched to having Vice President Harris be the primary candidate as opposed to Joe Biden. There is a massive tonal switch that I don't think really anyone can deny. If you watch the DNC, it just seemed like there was a lot more positivity in the room than there has been the last 8 years that we've seen from the Democratic Party.
It's really, so on that positive, moderate note, it's really important to engage people on a positive basis and not just attack. The other thing that's extremely good about the movement we're seeing, like Republicans for Harris, because I feel bad for people who are Republicans and they're not, but they don't like MAGA because it's too extreme. They don't have any home. They have nowhere to go because there's only 2 parties. And if we want to get our nation back into a more healthy, moderate place, it's not by demonizing each other. It's by actually reaching out to those. And so, like bridge building is important. And if you have a lot of people have family members or friends they don't talk to anymore because of politics, so you have to have those conversations. And you all the research says you should not shame them, you should not condescend to them. You have to meet them where they are and keep the connection going, because otherwise we don't have a civic fabric anymore. And that's what can lead to political violence, and nobody wants that except a small minority, very small minority of extremists. Most Americans don't want that. And in fact, some of the major issues, Americans are much more moderate than MAGA. They are for reproductive rights. They are for same-sex marriages. Those things have been accepted. And so there's a lot of repair we can do. That's why I'm also on this tour talking about these things. It's just, we can all do things our own way, have our own contribution. Because what is the alternative?
The continuation of this polarized political political scape doesn't really seem to be productive for anyone on either side of the spectrum, political spectrum. Thank you so much for sitting down with me today. This was really insightful. Where can people find you? Where can people keep up with your work?
Yeah, I have a Substack newsletter called Lucid, Lucid, and it's lucid.substack.com, and I publish essays on all of these things. It's global coverage as well as the U.S. And then on Instagram and Twitter, I'm at Ruth Ben-Ghiat, RuthBenGhiat.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.